Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's GCSE Biology live group tutorial. Today is on transport systems. So just a couple of notes from me. As usual, the session will be 1 hour long, so it will end at 4:15, and the session will be content from our tutor Charlotte, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you guys have any questions about what she is going through, just chuck that in the chat or the Q&A function, and then also if you have any questions on the online school, then pop those over to me as well, and we'll be able to answer. So as I said, today is on transport systems, and that will be led by our tutor Charlotte, who's a GCSE biology tutor, who's been with us for a while, so got lots of experience with my tutor, so it should be a really good session today. And this is just a bit about Charlotte. She's studied conservation and biodiversity at Exeter. So if we're all ready to kick off, Charlotte, then let's get started.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'll just take you to the lesson space and to our first slide here. I think everyone's here. I can see there's a few more participants joining occasionally, but I think we'll get started. So this is our second session this week for Biology GCSE, or the second one that I've completed. The first one was on digestion, and this, for the next hour, we're going to talk about transport systems within our bodies. So that leads on quite nicely from digestion, and before we talked about the lungs as well, and gas exchange in the lungs. So this kind of brings together those two systems and how they work in our bodies. Okay, so what are transport systems and why do we have them? So if we were single-celled organisms, like some bacteria or archaea, then diffusion would be enough for us to move the things that we need around our body, because it would be a very short diffusion pathway. However, when organisms get larger, so multi-celled organisms, and then really quite large, well-developed organisms like ourselves, the diffusion path gets too long for diffusion alone to be efficient. We are just too big for particles to be able to move around our bodies by diffusion alone. And there's also too much going on. We're very complex organisms as a whole as humans. So instead, we need a transport system to deliver the molecules that we need to the cells around our body. And in humans, our transport system is our blood vessels and our blood itself. It's very efficient. It's very, well, like anything in our bodies, it is very efficient and well thought out after thousands of years of evolution. So transport systems are made up of the tubes that carry materials from one part of the organism to another, and they make close contact with cells for exchange of substances. Runs in a network of veins, arteries and capillaries, we're going to talk about later, all around our bodies, and allows the molecules that we need to reach every cell, so that every cell is supplied with the nutrients and the oxygen that it needs for respiration and any other function that is taking place. So we just mentioned oxygen as a substance that's transported, but of course a byproduct of respiration is carbon dioxide, so that's also taken away from cells and then taken back to the lungs to be breathed out. Glucose, which is something that we get from our digestion, that also goes to our cells for respiration. And then also urea as a waste product, that's also transported in the blood. Antibodies as part of our immune system, and hormones as well, all transported in the blood. So our transport systems are a really important kind of connection mechanism for a lot of the things that we're learning about as part of Biology GCSE. Okay, so why does our blood move around that system? And that's all to do with the heart. So the heart pumps the blood around the body in a double circulatory system. The diagram that you can see here outlines, it's a very simplistic diagram about how our blood moves, but it shows quite nicely that there are two systems. So this is the heart in the middle here. And the heart is essentially a big ball of muscle that provides a huge amount of power sending the blood off around the body, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But the general structure of our transport system and our blood vessels is in what we call a double circulatory system. So blood travels in our pulmonary circuit, which is this circuit here. So it goes through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, picks up lots of oxygen, and then travels back to the heart again. The pulmonary circuit is under a lower pressure. So from our heart to our lungs isn't too far. They're all within our chest cavity. And so the blood doesn't need to be at a super high pressure to get there. So it tends to have a bit of a lower pressure than the next circuit that we're going to talk about. And it's purely there to take that oxygen away to the rest of the body and to drop off the carbon dioxide that is a waste product from the rest of our body. The next step that the blood takes is to go around the systemic circulation. So this is the second part of our double circulatory system. The systemic circulation blood leaves the heart in the aorta, which is an artery, travels down to the rest of our body through the hepatic artery to the liver, the mesenteric artery to our gut, the renal artery to our kidneys, and through further blood vessels to other organs. Anything in red on this diagram is an artery. This side here. Having gone to all of these different parts of our body, so all parts of our body, the blood then drops off whatever it needs to, so be that nutrient, oxygen, glucose, whatever those cells need, and then travels back to the heart through veins. So the renal veins, hepatic portal vein and hepatic vein, and finally the vena cava, which leads straight to the heart there. And then it'll be sent off again around the pulmonary circuit. Now, different parts of our bodies are quite a long way from the heart. If you think of the kind of distance from your heart to the tips of your toes, it's a long way. So the systemic circulation tends to be under higher pressure. Transports oxygen and nutrients to body cells and carries carbon dioxide and waste products away. Both of these systems are under a one-way flow. So blood only ever travels one way at a time. It can't get back. And there are valves. Oh, there's someone outside my window playing really loud music. Hold on 2 seconds. There we go. There's always something. So this one-way flow is ensured by valves in our veins, which means that we have these little kind of flaps within our veins that stop blood flow moving backwards. We'll talk more about them later as well. Okay, so here is the sequence of the heart beating. So we need to know this for GCSE Biology. We need to have an awareness of the main blood vessels that surround the heart and the sequence that the heart beats in. So we've got some nice diagrams here and we're going to talk through them now. So the heart is split into 4 sections. We have 2 areas at the top of the heart called the atria. One atrium on the right, one atrium on the left. And then we have 2 ventricles as well, and these are cavities at the bottom of the heart. You can see on these diagrams there's this light pink area, that's muscle surrounding the heart. You can see there's particularly thick muscle around the ventricles. And we're going to move over now and talk through the sequence, what happens as the blood enters. So, deoxygenated blood from the body enters the right atrium. So this is the right atrium on this diagram. That's it would be on the right-hand side of the body, which means that as you're looking at it on the screen here, it's the left-hand side. Blood enters from the body in the Vena Cava. So the Vena Cava goes into the right atrium, the chamber at the top of the heart there. There is a valve here, so it's going the other way. We also have oxygenated blood that's come from the lungs. So it's been to the lungs, it's picked up the oxygen, and now it's come back before it heads around the body. That's entering the left atrium. So this happens at the same time. So we've got blood bringing air, carbon dioxide and anything else from the body coming in through the Vena Cava, and then we've got oxygenated blood coming from the lungs, and they go into the atria at the top of the heart. What happens then is that the atria contract. So we have a contraction of the muscles around the atria here, and that drives the blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and the left atrium to the left ventricle. These valves here, the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve, prevent backflow of that blood. So it's now in the ventricle at the bottom of the heart. And then that big layer of muscle surrounding the ventricles at the bottom of the heart contracts. So this is the second part of the cycle. We have the atria contract first, ventricles contract second, and the blood is then sent under quite high pressure out through the pulmonary artery from the right side here. And the pulmonary artery, if you remember, takes blood to the lungs. So this is taking blood that's rich in carbon dioxide to the lungs so that that carbon dioxide can be breathed out and the blood can be loaded up with oxygen. Anything with the word pulmonary in it means lungs. So the two blood vessels that you need to remember as part of the pulmonary circulation are the pulmonary artery, which takes blood to the lungs, and the pulmonary vein that we mentioned earlier, that brings blood from the lungs and puts it back into the heart. And in turn, to go out around the body, the aorta is the big artery that takes blood away from the heart and sends it around the body. So you've got the Vena Cava bringing blood back from the body to the right atrium there, and then the aorta takes it to the body from the left ventricle. I admit it's quite confusing. It's quite a difficult thing to learn, but the best way is to draw lots of diagrams, memorize it, and just keep going through it again and again until you're really familiar with those four blood vessels and the sequence that the heart beats in. Okay, let's move on to controlling our heart rate. So our heart beats in our bodies without us knowingly making it. It's a bit like blinking. It's a muscle contraction that we don't have conscious control over. And naturally, that's controlled by specialized cells that are natural pacemakers. So pacemakers is our key word here. They're specialized cells in the heart itself that generate electrical impulses and cause those heart muscles to contract. So they cause the atrial muscles to contract first, and then the muscles around the ventricles to contract second. Sometimes those pacemakers don't work properly. And so then you can have an artificial pacemaker inserted. So artificial pacemakers are they're battery-operated little electrical devices that are implanted in the heart, and they send out those electrical impulses regularly to artificially control that heart rate. It's actually one of the most common pieces of heart surgery that's done. Artificial pacemakers are relatively common, and they can help with all sorts of conditions, anything to do with abnormal heartbeats or anything like that, they can be really useful for. But you need to know that heart rate is normally controlled by a natural pacemaker in the heart, and that in the case that this doesn't work properly, an artificial pacemaker can be implanted in there. The pacemaker works by its in a natural pacemaker, there's this group of specialized cells, and the electrical impulses that it sends out travel down through the muscle fibers and then cause that contraction. And in an artificial pacemaker, they do have kind of electrical fibers that are passed down veins in the heart and then cause that contraction with almost, it's an electrical impulse, it's almost like an electric shock to those muscles that makes them contract. Okay. So we've talked about our heart and what pumps our blood around that transport system. But what about the vessels themselves, the tubes that are the part of that transport system and that transport the blood? So you need to know the differences between arteries and veins and how they are adapted to their function. So I've got two diagrams here, arteries and veins, arteries on the left, veins on the right. An artery carries blood away from the heart. So we saw that blood left the heart in the aorta and it heads off to the lungs in the pulmonary artery. And there are several other arteries that continue to transport the blood around the body. So arteries are transporting blood that's under quite high pressure. When the ventricles contract in that really kind of strong way, the blood is sent away from the heart under quite high pressure. And it needs to travel a long way, the blood, which means that that pressure needs to be sustained in order to make sure that that blood reaches the tips of our toes from our heart. So they have these thick outer walls and a small lumen. And so the outer wall of the artery is thick in order to be able to withstand that pressure that the blood is traveling under. It has a thick layer of muscles and elastic fibers. That's the next layer in there. Put my pointer on, that might make it a bit easier. And the thick layer of muscles and elastic fibers again allows it to withstand that high pressure and to keep that blood going for as long as it can. Then you've got a small lumen. Again, this is all to keep that high pressure up. So the blood is traveling along a small space at high pressure. It keeps it going for a long time. The lumen is the word that we use to describe the kind of empty space in the middle where the blood is actually flowing. Arteries carry oxygenated blood around the body, except the pulmonary artery, which of course is carrying blood to the lungs and so is carrying blood that has dropped off all of its oxygen cells and is taking carbon dioxide back. But every other artery is transporting oxygenated blood around the body. And then in contrast to that, we have veins. So veins are kind of the opposite. So veins are carrying blood back to the heart. So the blood has gone to the cell, it's dropped off, say, the glucose and the oxygen for respiration, it's picked up the carbon dioxide and it's heading back to the heart. Because the blood is now under low pressure, we need to make sure that it keeps moving and has as little resistance as possible. So we have a thin layer of the outer wall of the vein, and a fairly thin layer of muscle and elastic fibers as well. We're not driving the blood so much now, we're just trying to give it as much opportunity to get back as we can. And they have a really large lumen, so there's as little resistance as possible. Because we're under lower pressure, you also need a kind of a little bit more encouragement for the blood. So you also have valves to prevent the backflow of blood in the veins. We talked about these earlier, and we also talked about them in the heart. Valves are little flaps that just can seal across the blood vessel and so prevent the blood going backwards. So we particularly have valves in our legs, because obviously it's a long way from our heart to our toes, and having got to our toes and dropped off, the blood then needs to get all the way back up our legs. So valves help with that, stop that backflow. The other blood vessel that we need to talk about is capillaries. So our arteries are transporting our oxygenated blood, and our veins take it away, but arteries and veins are quite big blood vessels. So we also have these small blood vessels that can get into all of the little kind of nooks and crannies in our bodies, right to the tips of our toes, and they're called capillaries. We've talked about capillaries a little bit in the lungs and a little bit in digestion as well, because they're the blood vessels that are quite closely connected with the cells where gas exchange and absorption of nutrients is happening. Because of that, they're very simple. So they have a wall made of a single layer of cells. That means that there is a short diffusion distance, or a short distance for absorption to take place in digestion, short diffusion distance for any gas exchange in the lungs. And they have a very small lumen. Usually in capillaries, the lumen is only enough to allow one blood cell through at a time. They are very, very small. And that means that each blood cell is used to the maximum. So here we've got a little diagram of cells and some exchange of substances across them. And then also our blood here within a capillary. So here's the arterial end of the capillary here. This is bringing in the oxygenated blood. And the venous end of the capillary on this side. So that's taking away any waste products. We've got one row of cells here. We've got another row of cells here. And the capillary is small enough to fit in between them. We've also got a layer here of tissue fluid, which provides a kind of medium for a lot of the dissolving and some of the gas exchange there as well. So you can see here that oxygen is moving out of the blood and into the cells to be used in respiration. And in turn, we've got waste products, CO2, that's moving out of the cells and back to the blood vessel here into the capillary. We've also got glucose, which has been produced through digestion, the breakdown of complex carbohydrates into glucose means that we've now got glucose in our blood, it's been absorbed. And then that can go straight to the cells to also be used in respiration to provide us with energy. And then we've also got this waste product of other processes, urea, that can dissolve there into the blood and be carried away and disposed of by the liver. So we've got this exchange of substances happening all the time from our blood to our cells, and that's what is a hugely vital part of keeping our bodies going and making sure that we're working efficiently. Okay, what about the blood itself? Oh, yeah. Well, we've talked about how the blood travels around the body and the vessels that it travels in. So now what about blood itself? So blood is made up of 4 things that you need to know about. So 55% of it, you can see on this pie chart here, is plasma. Plasma is a straw-coloured liquid, transports carbon dioxide, digested food molecules, urea, and hormones. So plasma is sort of a liquid medium for a lot of the things that we need. It provides an ideal place for molecules like urea or hormones to travel in. And it makes up more than half of the blood. But then 45% of the blood is made up of red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. Red blood cells transport oxygen, platelets are involved in blood clotting, and white blood cells are involved in ingesting pathogens and producing antibodies as part of our immune system. We're going to talk more about each of those 3 parts of the blood now. Okay. So red blood cells, let's start with those. Red blood cells are really important for absorbing oxygen in the lungs. They then pass through the capillaries and then they release oxygen for respiration in cells. So red blood cells are the red cells that you usually see in diagrams. They're really, really important for transporting oxygen for respiration. So you need to know how red blood cells are adapted for this function. And this diagram here demonstrates that nicely. So let's start with their size and shape. So they're very small and flexible so that they can travel through capillaries. We talked about how capillaries are normally 1 cell wide in their lumen. Well, that's normally a red blood cell width wide. So they can travel through those capillaries. And they have a biconcave shape. So biconcave shape, you can kind of see it here. So they have a dip either side. This maximizes the area for oxygen binding. So they have a huge surface area in comparison to their size for that binding of oxygen. And in order to bind that oxygen, they contain the protein hemoglobin, which combines reversibly with oxygen. So at the lungs, the hemoglobin binds oxygen particles, and then the red blood cell travels through capillaries to the cells where the hemoglobin releases that oxygen and allows it to dissolve into the cells. You need to know about hemoglobin there. They also have no nucleus, so they can carry more hemoglobin. So they're very simple cells, no nucleus at all. They are just for transporting oxygen. Okay, then we have white blood cells. There are 2 types of white blood cell that you need to know about, phagocytes and lymphocytes. So phagocytes are the cool white blood cells that engulf pathogens. So you can see this pathogen here in the blue. The white blood cell comes along, sends sort of part of itself around the pathogen and then engulfs it and ingests it and then digests it and breaks it down. So they're really good at recognizing pathogens, engulfing them, digesting them. Then we have lymphocytes, which form another part of our immune system. So they're white blood cells that produce antibodies. Those antibodies bind to a pathogen, and then that allows the body to recognize that pathogen and to generate other immune responses that deal with it or break it down. So lymphocytes are really important for producing those antibodies. And finally, we have platelets. Platelets tend to get kind of a little bit forgotten about when we're talking about blood because we get so focused on our red blood cells and our white blood cells, which form a huge part of what our bodies do. But platelets are really important as well. So they're produced in the bone marrow, and they have proteins on their surface that help them stick to broken blood vessels and to each other. They're very sticky, platelets. They also secrete proteins, and that all helps with blood clotting. So if you ever get a scratch on any part of your body, on your hand, say, it's platelets that cause that clotting of the blood and then help to form that scab over the top. So it's a protein called fibrin that they use, and it binds all of the platelets together and forms that clot to kind of block that breakage in the blood vessel and allow the blood to keep carrying on uninterrupted. So we need to remember that our platelets are for blood clotting. Okay, so that is all we're going to cover today in terms of content. So now I've got a couple of exam questions to kind of have a look at, and we can see what it's like in an exam, kind of do some exam technique as well. Let's have a quick look at the questions that you've sent in. I'll try and answer some of those now, and then we'll do another question session after we've done a past question.
Yeah, there have been a few coming through. Do you want me to let you know the ones that haven't been answered?
That'd be great too, if that's okay.
Awesome, yeah, of course. Do artificial pacemakers use electricity?
They do, yes. So they have little batteries in them, and they are programmed in order to send out that very regular electrical impulse that travels down through the heart into the muscles and causes that contraction. So yes, they do use electricity. It's quite a strange thing to think of in your body, but they are, like I say, quite widely used. They are very
cool. And the blood vessels diagram, someone's asked, next to where it says a vein on that diagram, what does the VS stand for?
Oh, that is, I'll just try and find it now. Here we are. So that's, my slide's slightly been distorted when I uploaded it into the lesson space. It was supposed to be arteries versus veins because we're comparing them here. It's quite a common exam question, so comparing and contrasting how arteries and veins are made up.
Cool. Just a couple more questions. So why does the artery have a small lumen? Shouldn't it be large to be able to carry more blood?
Yes, so this is quite a difficult one to explain. So we need to be wary of getting confused between the amount of blood being transported and the pressure that it's under. So we have the same amount of blood traveling around our bodies all the time. So it's not that arteries are carrying more blood, it's that the blood that they're carrying is being propelled along more strongly because it's come from the heart very recently. So it had that really strong heartbeat to send it off through the artery. And that's why it has that small lumen. Because the blood's under high pressure and you want to keep it under high pressure and maintain that pressure as it travels through the body, it's best to keep the area that it's traveling through small. So if you think of, I don't know whether you've ever tried to drink a drink out of two different size straws. So when you have a smaller straw, the drink gets to your mouth quicker. It's easier to generate enough pressure to get that liquid into your mouth. Whereas if you've got a really large straw, like some of those ones that you get in juice drinks and things like that, if you order them, particularly when you're on holiday, you tend to get quite big straws with them. And those, you have to kind of generate a lot more pressure in order to drink your drink. So think of it like that. Think of it as a straw. You need a small straw for an artery, and then veins can be a bit bigger because they're not under as much pressure by then. So you're just looking for less resistance rather than keeping any pressure on. Does that make sense?
Brilliant. And we've had, what if the battery runs out in the artificial pacemaker?
It's a good question. And the answer is that they are made so that they don't run out. So they recharge themselves, as far as I know, or they're extremely long lasting. I think it might be a combination of them both. So the battery doesn't run out, but if you do have an artificial pacemaker, you do have to go for regular checkups to obviously test that it's working okay. It's pretty important. But because they're so widely used, they are very reliable.
Great. And just a couple more questions before we move on, and then I will make sure to save the other questions for the session at the end. So why do the arteries and veins not carry blood to the pulmonary vein?
Why? So this is the difference between the pulmonary and the systemic circuit. So if we go to here, this one, so we can view those circuits. So in this diagram, all of the vessels in red are carrying oxygenated blood. And all of the vessels in blue are carrying deoxygenated blood. And in general, oxygenated blood is taken away from the heart to different parts of our body through arteries. So the aorta here is an artery, the hepatic artery, mesenteric artery, and the renal artery. They're all examples of arteries. But then we have our pulmonary circuit, which turns this on its head, because the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood, and the pulmonary vein carries oxygenated blood, whereas around the rest of our body, veins are the ones that carry the deoxygenated blood, they're the blue ones. So the key to remember with arteries is that arteries carry blood away from the heart. So that includes the aorta and then also the pulmonary artery there. So where on this slide I say that veins carry deoxygenated blood apart from the pulmonary vein, well, that's because the pulmonary vein is actually carrying oxygenated blood because it's been to the lungs and it's picked up the oxygen and it's taking the oxygenated blood back to the heart. So in general, arteries carry blood away from the heart to the body and veins carry blood back to the heart from the body, except for in the pulmonary circuit where it's the other way around. Okay, how's that?
Brilliant. Just one more question and then we'll move on. And it was, are arteries and veins the same colour?
Oh, good question. In our bodies, generally, yes, they're a very similar colour. They are slightly different, but they are generally quite a similar colour in our bodies themselves, but normally in diagrams you'll see arteries in red and veins in blue. That seems to just be the way that they are in diagrams. It's been that way. It's a way across all syllabuses and across all disciplines that you show that oxygenated blood travels in red arteries and deoxygenated blood is blue and travels in veins. But in general, the blood vessels in our bodies are the same. So you can see if you look at the veins on your hand now, they are kind of vaguely blue when you're looking at them there. But the blood obviously is always red that runs through them. So deoxygenated blood isn't blue. It's still red, but that's the way that we depict it in diagrams.
Cool, let's move on and then we'll go back to all the remaining questions at the end.
Perfect. Okay, let's have a quick look at this long exam question. So I picked this one because it's a really good kind of recap of what we've just learned. And it's a good way of showing the exam technique that you need for these long answer questions, which are normally the ones that are kind of most intimidating to look at and answer because there's a lot of space to write and they tend to be quite general and it's quite difficult to sort of pick out what you want to say. So the first thing on any question is to underline the keywords to make sure that you've read the question properly. Keyword here is explain. That's our command word, and we know that we need to provide an explanation. We don't need to list 3 reasons, we need to explain something. How the human circulatory system is adapted to supply oxygen to the tissues and remove waste products from tissues. Okay, this is very general, and you can have an awful lot of different answers, so I've listed them here. It's a 6-mark question, and in general, what we say is that it's 1 point per mark. You need to make sure to include keywords as well. So I've made a list here of the points that you can have, and I've structured it so that we talk about our circulation and kind of follow the blood around in its journey of supplying oxygen to the tissues and then removing waste products from the tissues. So we've started with quite a general statement. Humans have a double circulatory system which ensures higher blood pressure and a greater flow of blood to tissues. Okay. Then I've moved on to the heart pumps blood to the lungs in the pulmonary artery so that oxygen can diffuse from air in the alveoli to the blood in the capillaries and return to the heart in the pulmonary vein. So there I've talked through the pulmonary circuit. It's that first circuit we talked through from the double circulatory system. So the heart pumps blood to the lungs, oxygen diffuses from the alveoli to the blood, and then returns to the heart in the pulmonary vein. Then oxygen is carried by red blood cells that contain hemoglobin to bind oxygen. So then we've gone on to talk about how the blood is adapted to its function of carrying oxygen. Arteries then carry oxygenated blood away from the heart to the tissues. So if you remember the systemic circuit, the blood heads through the aorta and out through arteries to the rest of the body. To tissues, so tissues are, in this case, where the cells are, where the capillaries deliver oxygen to cells for respiration. So it's there that the oxygen diffuses from the blood to the cell. And the capillaries are adapted for this. They have thin walls, which allows easy diffusion of oxygen into the cell and carbon dioxide and waste products back into the blood. So there we talked about the exchange that we talked about on that slide with the capillary diagram. So we're exchanging that oxygen for carbon dioxide. We've given off our glucose and are picking up other waste products like urea. The blood then returns to the heart via veins that have valves to prevent backflow. Okay, so that's 6 points there. And we've talked at each time, we've tried to suggest how the circulatory system is adapted for its particular function, supplying oxygen to the tissues and removing waste products from the tissues. Okay, that's 6 marks there. And then I've also got a slightly simpler question that I'll put up for you now. So let's put another one of these up. Okay, so here's a nice question. Whenever you've got a diagram like this, it's best to look through it first carefully before you read the question. Parts of the blood can be separated from each other by spinning the blood in a centrifuge. Okay, so we're talking about parts of the blood. We covered that today. The image below shows the separated parts of a 10 centimetre cubed blood sample. So, when you use a centrifuge, it splits those different components up by weight. So we've got the plasma on the top, white blood cells and platelets in the middle, and then lots of red blood cells at the bottom. A, calculate the percentage of the blood that's made up of plasma. Okay, have a think about that for a few seconds and I will paste in the answer. So here we have, so the difference between them, so 5.5 divided by 10 times 100. 55%, that one. Okay. Then let's look at part B, that question. Move this down. Okay, here's part B. Name 3 chemical substances transported by the blood. Gosh. You can have any from a long list here. This is a 3-mark question. So it's 1 mark per substance transported by the blood. Note they're saying chemical substances here. So this isn't parts of the blood. This is substances that are transported by the plasma within the blood. Okay, so what's transported in the plasma? It's a long list, but reading the question here means that you need to make sure that you don't say oxygen, because that's transported in the red blood cells rather than the plasma. I'll paste up the list for you now. What you can have. So, as part of the biology syllabus, you'll learn about lots and lots of different substances that are transported in the blood, so not just the ones that we've talked about today. So any one of these you could have had. Amino acids, so those are the components of proteins. Antibodies as part of the immune system. Antitoxins, also part of the immune system. Carbon dioxide travels in the plasma rather than in the red blood cells. Red blood cells are only adapted for carrying oxygen, remember. Cholesterol, you could also have. Enzymes as well, they travel in the blood. Fatty acids, they're part of fats, so fats are broken down to fatty acids, and glycerol, which is also listed there. Both of those can then fuse into the blood. Glucose as well, we talked about that a lot today. Hormones, any type of ions, you'll talk about a lot of ions when you talk about homeostasis, so you'll know some of those. Some proteins, urea, vitamins, or water. You could have any of those, and you just needed to pick 3. Okay, shall we answer some more questions, just to make sure that we don't run out of time?
Yeah, good idea. We had a few from earlier. So are there more red blood cells or white blood cells in our blood?
There are more red blood cells in general, because they, I don't want to say that they have a more important job, but they certainly, they're needed for transporting more oxygen than white blood cells are for pathogens. But we do produce more white blood cells if we have pathogens in our blood. So the number of white blood cells does vary a bit, but in general you tend to have more red blood cells.
Cool, and please excuse my pronunciation on any of these science terms. I'm not a scientist. What's the difference between fatty acids and glycerol, please?
Glycerol. Good question. So, and now you're all going to have to excuse my drawing. So, when we have fats in that we eat as part of our food, so they're part of butter in particular, any sort of oils or spreads that you eat, they'll have fat content. So fats are made up of a sort of spine of glycerol, and then fatty acid chains coming off that glycerol. So they're both components of fats. They have different chemical structures that we talk about another time. But glycerol forms the spine of the fat, and then fatty acids form those chains. They're almost like tails. And so when a fat's broken down, it's broken down into those kind of 2 components, so glycerol and then fatty acid chains.
Okay. Great. And what is homeostasis?
Homeostasis is the process of the body keeping all of its levels correct, or at optimum levels. So homeostasis is how we describe the process of, say, us keeping us at a constant temperature. So humans always run at about 37.5 degrees C. Or of keeping our water levels constant across our body. Things like that. It's something that you'll learn about as another part of GCSE. There are a few kind of more specific details that we'll go into.
Thanks. And just some questions on the exam questions. So were the questions foundation or higher level?
These are, they're both from higher level sources, but that doesn't mean that they're not foundation level. If you see what I mean, because quite often there'll be some foundation questions in a higher question paper. So I did get them from higher level sources.
Great. And so a question was, could we name 3 types of enzymes in the question that asks about naming chemical substances?
Ooh, To be safe, I would say no. Looking at the mark scheme, which I do have here, it does say a maximum of 1 named example. And it says for ions and hormones and enzymes as well. So no, you couldn't necessarily name 3 different enzymes. I would, try to include some more variety in there just to be safe.
Great, and back to the artificial pacemaker, a couple of questions on that. So do artificial pacemakers last a long time? / another question was, how long can they last for? And how do you charge the pacemaker?
So the answer to how long they last is I don't actually know. They do last a lifetime in that, they are a permanent thing. They are not put in as a temporary measure. They are something that you tend to have for the rest of your life. As far as the charging goes, as far as I know, and I've never had much to do with them. I've got a couple of friends that have them actually, but I've never asked how they recharge. So it's a combination of them having very long lasting batteries and I think using some of that electrical impulse energy to recharge themselves as well. I'm pretty sure it's a combination of them both. It's not part of the GCSE specification, so don't worry, you won't be asked about how they charge themselves or anything in an exam, but it is quite interesting to know.
Thank you. And for question 1B, can I write digested food molecules instead of writing specific substances?
You would be correct. What I've pasted there is what is in the mark scheme. So I think that would be slightly at the discretion of the examiner, and then if enough people answered it, then it would be put forward to a board and they would discuss whether it was an acceptable answer in general. I think, again, you'd be safer being a bit more specific there and trying to, put down different types of digested food molecules. But you would be correct, digested food molecules are carried in the blood. So I think it's more that you'd be slightly shortchanging yourself by not giving yourself so many options of what to answer for the other 2 lines. It's a bit of a fine line, that one, isn't it? Why would you only be allowed? I think you could have a certain type of enzyme, going back to the earlier question, but I wouldn't name 3 enzymes. And you could have digested food molecules, but they are kind of looking for you to be a little bit more specific.
Cool, thanks Charlotte. Just a few more questions. Thanks guys for sending in so many. So one was about the batteries. What kind of batteries? They said, do you mean like AA Duracell batteries?
No, they're much more advanced than that one. So I'm going to have a quick look, see if there's any more information about this. I've never looked into batteries of pacemakers particularly. Hmm. My advice would be to do some Googling. As I say, you don't need to know any more about batteries for your GCSE, but it is quite interesting. So by all means, do go away and have a look. But as I say, they're not kind of Duracell batteries that you change occasionally. They are more advanced than that and much longer lasting.
Great, thank you. Just a couple more. So how does plasma transport different substances around the body?
Okay, so plasma is made up mostly of water. So it's kind of like in a glass of water. You could put in some sugar, you could put in some squash, you could put in some salt, and it would all dissolve in it. There's a bit more to plasma because it has a lot of different things dissolved in it. So it's plasma is kind of the liquidy part of blood as such. So it basically forms kind of a medium that things can dissolve or diffuse into.
Great. And how, I assume the phrasing of this is meant to be, how do hemoglobin help red blood cells?
So hemoglobin is a protein that's carried in red blood cells, and it's carried in red blood cells purely for the purpose of binding that oxygen. So hemoglobin is a protein, which means it has a specific structure. That structure is complementary to oxygen, so that allows hemoglobin to bind oxygen. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's what you need to know for GCSE, that hemoglobin is how red blood cells keep hold of oxygen while it's transporting it in the blood. So the hemoglobin doesn't help the red blood cell itself, but it's essential for the red blood cell's function.
Great, and then in the last couple of minutes, we had some more general questions about GCSE biology. So one was, if students want to practice biology questions, what do you think is the best place to find sort of past papers, the best websites, and also for students who struggle with biology, what's sort of the best tips you'd give them to improve in the subject?
Okay, I really recommend BBC Bite Size. That's what, well, it's where a few of these diagrams were from and other things. I think it's a really good site, and it also provides exam specification specific ones. So if you're doing AQA or OCR or EdExcel, it will provide kind of specific content that you can look through, and then it also provides past questions as well. So that's sort of what I recommend. I think it's a really reliable site to use. And then in general, biology is quite different to some subjects like maths, where you just have to practice and practice and practice, because biology is also about learning the content as much as answering the questions. So it depends how you learn. So we're all a combination of visual, auditory and kinesthetic learners. We all learn by seeing, hearing or doing. So it's good to kind of be aware of what works best for you. Do you like to do things like making revision notes? So drawing mind maps is a doing thing for kinesthetic learners. Writing out lists is another thing. Are you an auditory learner? Is it good to listen to tutorials like this one, or you can make recordings and then listen to them on repeat to help you revise things? Or are you a visual learner? Do you need to make diagrams? So again, that combines quite well with doing things, making diagrams or mind maps. But as a visual learner, sometimes your brain can work well, as in it will remember that there's 3 bullet points or 4 bullet points that you need to remember under what are the different components of blood. And then you'll know that there's 4 things you need to remember, and you can go from there. So it's working out how you learn best and making sure that you kind of tailor your learning to that. That's probably my biggest tip.
Brilliant, thanks for those tips. And I think we'll have to wrap up there. If your question didn't get answered, sorry about that. I know there were loads of questions this session, so thank you so much. And maybe we can just revisit a couple of those questions at the start of the next session if you guys have a burning question to ask Charlotte. But remember, for things like definitions and stuff, Google is your best friend, so just search things up there. But thank you so much for today. I hope this has been a valuable lesson for you guys. And then just a reminder that tomorrow, Thursday, we've got chemistry, English, maths and physics tutorials. So hope to see lots of you there. And thank you so much, Charlotte, for a brilliant lesson. Guys, have a really good afternoon. As always, these lessons are recorded, so you'll be able to access these through the My Tutor YouTube channel. So see you all in another session soon. Bye.
Bye.